Good morning and a very warm welcome to this EPC update, our regular look at key developments in and around the European Union. My name is Jacki Davis. I'm a senior advisor to the European Policy Centre, and with me this week, as always, Fabian Zuleeg, Chief Executive and Chief Economist of the EPC, and Janis Emmanouilidis, Deputy Chief Executive and Director of Studies. A very warm welcome to both of you, and if it's not too late to say it, a Happy New Year to you and to everyone who joins us regularly on Update. Today, we're going to be discussing whether the EU 27 can exit crisis mode in 2023. What are the challenges that lie ahead, and do they have the political will and the capacity to tackle them? As always, totally interactive questions from me to Fabian and Janis, and I hope also from all of you. You can, as always, either write them, click on the Q&A button, not the chat, please, the Q&A button, and please be as brief as possible, or click on the raised hands button, and when the time comes, I will allow you to talk, and you simply open your microphone. So let us jump straight in, gentlemen, and in terms of your overall assessment of where we are right now and the challenges ahead in the coming months. And I'm just wondering, really, can we talk? Is it realistic to talk about exiting crisis mode in 2023? Or given the situation in Ukraine and all the other issues we're discussing, is that really not a realistic prospect at all? Fabian?
I'm not sure we should be discussing whether it's crisis mode or not crisis mode. But realistically, the important thing we have to keep in mind is that the challenges which we are facing are nowhere near over. And actually, in many ways, the most difficult bit is still to come. We still have to make decisions across a number of different areas, which are much more systemic, much more structural. We have to also start to make contingency plans for a variety of different challenges which we are going to be facing, including the next winter. The energy question, the cost of living question, we haven't resolved. We have been rather lucky that the winter hasn't been as cold as we had feared, but some of the structural issues are still there. And the additional challenge is political. In all of these questions, we are actually going to see more of the kind of debate, the kind of conflict between member states we have seen in the last few days, in the last few weeks. So overall, I would say 2023 is going to be an extremely difficult year. And in many ways, it's a decisive year. I think we have to make decisions which will determine long-term outcomes.
Thank you. And I want to come back on many of those issues you've mentioned a little bit later on. But Janis, first of all, your overall assessment. A difficult year, extremely difficult year, and a decisive year. Would you agree?
I think we're probably going to have a difficult year in front of us. But let me start with a word of caution. I think we need to be very careful when we look into the future these days and try to predict what will happen. Let's just assume we would be 1 year ahead. It would be January of 2022. We probably would not have predicted the full amount and full scale of what we have of the challenge which we're now facing, especially linked to the war in Ukraine and all the consequences of that. So there is a need to be cautious when you look into the crystal ball. But if you transcend about beyond the current moment and you look into the challenges which we have, and Fabian was referring to some of them, we still have the major systemic transitions which we need to tackle when it comes to issues related to climate change, when it comes to digitalization, when it comes to our need to enhance our economic security. So there are major structural challenges which we're facing. And then if you look at the list of crises which we're facing, or challenges, inflation crisis, cost of living, migration pressures on the single market, the question of energy supplies when we look into the next winter. So this winter was a positive one, as Fabian was mentioned, but we do not know how the situation will be in the next winter coming. So you have all these very concrete challenges which we are dealing with. And as I said, I think the most immediate challenge still is the war in Ukraine, and there might also be a re-escalation of that, or probably will be one, which we will be witnessing in the spring with an unclear outcome. Which will affect all of the crises which we mentioned. In many ways, we are witnessing a polycrisis under the conditions of a permacrisis, if you want to link both of these terms with each other. So it will be a difficult year. It is also a decisive year, and the feeling which some seem to have, which is that we are somewhat managing, that we can muddle through, that we will do the things we have to do if the pressure is there to do them. I think that logic is not the right logic to apply, but I think we're going to discuss a lot of that in the course of the next hour.
Fabian, you wanted to jump back in?
Yeah, I just wanted to add that in Europe, we've been talking since February last year about the Zeitenwende, the watershed, the new era. And I think that's something I want to remind listeners that this is a new era. So in many ways, we are never going to go back to the world as it was before the invasion, to the world which was in many ways rather more benign than the world we are facing now. And I think this, what Janis was just mentioning, this feeling that, well, we'll just have to get over this difficult period and afterwards we'll go back to some form of normal. This is the new normal. This is the world we are living in. And that is a more challenging, a more contested world we're living in. And we are going to have to deal with that. And we have to make the decisions which are appropriate to this era, not to the previous one.
Thank you very much. And we'll come back on whether there is the political will, the capacity, the recognition of that. But sorry, Janis, you wanted to react?
It was relating to that, to the recognition factor. Because just adding to what Fabian was saying, if you talk to people from all around the EU27, if you also travel and discuss with people in national capitals, you will see that there's a huge discrepancy between the appreciation of the gravity of the moment among the EU27. If you travel, and there is where geopolitics really matter. The closer you get to Ukraine, the more you will witness, you will feel, not only witness, you will feel the sincere worries which people have in terms of if this goes wrong in terms of our reaction to the war in Ukraine. So there is a major discrepancy between member states. And that is something I think which is a worrisome development, which you can witness in front of our eyes.
Thank you very much. And the implications of that, again, I'd like to come back to a bit later on. But let us start with what you, Janis, said was the most pressing and, of course, the most difficult challenge. And we don't know quite how it will evolve, but the sense is it's going to get worse. As you say, a major spring offensive is predicted. Ukraine, we've had a week of dramatic developments. Finally, after months of debate and discussion, Germany did a U-turn and agreed to not only supply battle tanks itself, but also to allow others, most notably Poland, to do so. Is that enough? I see reports that discussions already beginning from a military point of view on whether this should now extend to jet fighters, whether we need to move beyond that in military support. But broadly, and Janis, maybe start with you this time, in terms of the support Ukraine will need, not just military, but humanitarian, economic, and so on. How do you see the months ahead? What does the Ukraine need most from the European Union and from the member states?
Well, if you talk to and listen to our Ukrainian friends, what they will be telling you is that they need military support. Now, I think the decision to provide them with high-level capacity tanks is something which is moving in the right direction, something which they have been asking for a while. And as you were indicating, Jacki, they're already now asking for more because they see as to what the situation is probably going to develop to in the course of the spring. You see that the Russian military forces are preparing themselves for an offensive. They have huge amounts of soldiers now under arms. So what you hear from Ukrainians is first and foremost military support. Followed closely by that is the need for economic support, because the country, obviously, because of the war, is in a dire economic situation. It is dependent on external funding. Now, external funding is coming, but there still is a request for more. Then there's also the question of, and there are high hopes in Ukraine with respect to moving closer to their main foreign policy strategic target, which is EU accession. They're taking this very serious. They are having high hopes that actually this will materialize. I think they're not naive. They know that this will take some time, but they want to see that progress will be there. So you see that there's a huge amount of things which they're asking for and aspiring to get from the EU27. And the question is whether we will be living up to that. But my personal appreciation is that the pressures will increase in the spring, given the situation on the ground. We're seeing that atrocities are continuing, the war is continuing, but I think that we will reach a new level of in the war in Ukraine, and that will increase also the pressure on us from Kiev.
And as that pressure increases, Fabian, what is your sense of the EU's will and capacity to respond? I was struck by what Janis said earlier about discrepancies or divergences in how seriously different member states see the threat, see the need to respond. Do you believe that the EU can hold together, that it can deliver, albeit sometimes with the sort of arguments and delays that we saw over the question of tanks?
I mean, I think what we've seen with the tanks just now is going to be rather typical of the response we're going to see. That while overall the consensus and the need to support Ukraine is there, there are now many other factors which come into these decisions, mostly at the domestic level. And that will influence how the countries will interact with each other. The second dimension to that is also the question of how much pressure is there going to be from Ukraine itself, which has been rather adept in putting pressure on reluctant governments, but also from the US. And then it will also depend on what happens on the ground. And I think there's a big question here about whether the war is going to change nature. Are we going to see a new offensive by Russia, which is more effective than what they have done before? If that is the case, the pressure to provide more material to Ukraine is going to be very high. Or are we going to see a spring offensive by Ukraine, which is successful, which is then about recapturing territory? Very different. It's essentially a much more offensive war, which Ukraine then has to fight. So there are many, many uncertainties, but overall, I think what we are going to see is more argument, more fragmentation, more difficulty, also because what we're seeing at the domestic level at the moment is a rather more inward-looking world. I think in many areas, we are actually going backwards rather than forward.
Indeed, we'll come back on some of those areas where we seem to be more inward looking. But just to follow up on that, Fabian, and then Janis, you said more argument, more fragmentation. What will the consequences be if the EU cannot cope with those arguments, find ways through, as they have done up until now? If the EU fails to deliver, and we'll come back on the question of membership negotiations, but if expectations aren't met, and if the Ukrainians feel so from a psychological point of view, but also obviously from a very practical point of view, what will the consequences be for the EU and the world if these arguments cannot be resolved?
Well, if we fail to deliver in terms of showing strong support and continuous strong support for Ukraine in its fight for its sovereignty, for its right to determine its own future, I think this will have massive effects, obviously, on the country itself, on the people of Ukraine. These are the ones who are mostly affected by what is happening, but it will also have strong effects on us, because if actually Ukraine fails to not only defend itself, but also regain some of the sovereignty which is lost in public parts of their country, and there will be a strong signals towards Moscow that it can make sense to engage in similar experiments and endeavors in the future. The fears which the Baltics is that they might be affected, the fears of the Moldovians is that they might be affected, and we should carefully listen to all these fears which they have, arguing that actually there is a strategy behind this, and if we send the wrong signal, towards Putin and those supporting him, that long-term strategy will continue. So we will be under continuous pressure. And if you imagine a world of that sort, and then look at our ability to defend ourselves and our dependence on the US, where we would be if the US would not have invested, and it is investing everything into helping the Ukraine to defend itself, we see how much of a challenge this is. And we also see how much it is affecting all these different other policy areas which we have been talking about. Most people now in Europe are concerned about the energy situation, about the cost of living crisis, about inflation, and all that is in many ways and in different ways linked to what is happening in the war in Ukraine. So if we think that this is something which we don't have to divert too much attention to in future and try to push it away, this would be exactly the wrong thing to do.
Fabian, your thoughts on that, and also on, I mentioned the German U-turn on tanks earlier this week. The very strong criticism of Olaf Scholz, saying he only does it when he has literally no alternative. He's dragged kicking and screaming into doing the right thing. How much damage do you believe this has done to Germany's reputation, to German and EU leadership on this issue? And where do you sense, we'll come back on the broader question of leadership, but on Ukraine specifically, I mean, there are those who say Germany has also pushed the US into doing more, and therefore it has been effective in that sense. What's your reading of it and the long-term consequences?
I mean, firstly, I think if we don't manage to do what is necessary, the damage which is going to be done to the European Union goes way beyond our ability to react to what is happening in Ukraine. Because fundamentally, this is about this new area we're living in. And what we should be realizing, but unfortunately, the signs are not that good that we're realizing this, is that in this new era, we are facing a number of very fundamental common challenges. And these common challenges are not addressable at the national level. We cannot continue the way we have done before. But yet, at least at the political level, I think it's interesting when you look at some of opinion polls, which actually indicate that populations are further along than their leaders. At the political level, this recognition is not there. So one of the dangers is that if we are finding that things are getting more conflictual, the option will then be to say, okay, let's be less ambitious. Let's not do things together. Let's go back to national action. Every country does whatever they can manage domestically. We don't really coordinate it at the European level. We don't really have that common action at the European level, which is exactly the wrong direction we should be avoiding at this moment in time. But that, I think, is part of the overall picture. Yeah. And the saga with the Leopard 2s really plays into that, because and I think this is something which is rather worrying when you talk to people in Berlin. There isn't the recognition of the damage which has already been done, that the level of trust, the level of acceptance that there needs to be co-leadership by Germany in this situation. I'm not saying that Germany should be leading Europe. I think that's the wrong message. But Germany has to be part of the solution, because ultimately Germany is far too big, far too powerful to be on the outside. So the damage, the trust which has already been lost, is something which is already hampering common action. So I know people in Germany sometimes say this is not a U-turn, this has actually been very well considered. We just wanted to think about this more deeply. We wanted to bring the Americans on board, all of that. Well, my answer to that is threefold. One is the communication has been terrible. So even if that was your aim, you have not got that across. What came across is very different. Secondly, don't underestimate what damage you have already done and how little other countries are believing that this is the real reason why this is happening. And thirdly, if you argue that there are underlying reasons for this, then where's your action in those areas? So one of the reasons, for example, which has been given is that this would be weakening the Bundeswehr, and the Bundeswehr is unfortunately not in a great state. So some people are saying they can't really afford to give any tanks to Ukraine. If that's the case, then where is the investment in the Bundeswehr? Where is the procurement of new weapons? Where is the change in industrial policy which will be needed? And we're not seeing action there. So unfortunately, the only conclusion I can draw from that is that what you're actually saying is the reason is not really the underlying reason, and it is about domestic politics. It is about personal reluctance.
And your point, and Janis, this point about the communications, I mean, I have read that Olaf Scholz, people in the Chancellery think, no, there's a virtue in this. I'm taking my time. I'm not responding to pressures. I'm going to make the right decisions at the right times. Clearly an indication that they don't understand how this is perceived elsewhere. Your sense of how much damage is being done and the consequences. We are talking about the country that has traditionally always led the EU. Now the country being dragged into decisions. What does that mean for the EU?
Well, first of all, it is damaging Germany. It is damaging the perception and also the trust towards Berlin. And by the way, not only within the EU, but also across the pond in Washington, where there was a high degree of annoyance about the lack of appreciation that a decision had to be taken faster. That was especially vivid last Friday after Rammstein. So there is undermining Germany's position within the European Union, and that is not only bad news from the Berlin perspective, it is a bad news from the EU perspective in general, because obviously in these difficult times, you need co-leadership, to use the term, I think, which Fabian was indicating. You need co-leadership, but you also need co-leadership to include a Germany which is clear in terms of what it is aspiring to and the direction it wants to be moving. And what you can really strongly sense is that people do not understand why a decision is not taken. Now, you could argue that often Angela Merkel, in her 16 years, often waited until the last moment also to take a decision when she was convinced, when she was also convinced that
it became
her
a verb, didn't it, to Merkel?
Sorry?
It became a verb to Merkel.
Exactly. And so, but this time, and this is different to Merkel, with Angela Merkel, you knew the main reason why she was hesitating. You might have disagreed with why she's hesitating, but you were aware of the thinking. Okay. And the second main difference was that she was communicating also behind the scenes with colleagues at the European level, and not only with main colleagues, with main member states, but also with all member states who had a particular concern about that issue. And now this is not being done to the same extent. And the last point, I think, was alluding the numerous reasons which play into the inability of Scholz to take faster decisions. But I think it is multiple factors which make him take or don't take decisions. And that makes it so difficult to understand. So it has to do with his personal historical readings of the situation. It has to do with internal concerns, party concerns, which he has to take into account.
We need to move on to other issues in a moment. I have a couple more quick questions about Ukraine. There's a broader question from the audience, but Fabian, you wanted to jump in quickly, if you would, please.
Yeah, just to add that while I think it is right that we're focusing on Germany, given its role, but also given its special historical responsibility, I think we should also mention that it's not the case that the rest of the European Union is doing what is needed or is making the decisions which are appropriate to this. What we are seeing at the moment is that there are taboos in every member state, and that we're struggling to overcome these taboos. So it's always looking across the border saying, yes, the other countries aren't doing what they should be doing, but there's very little self-reflection to say, what is it we need to do which is different from before? What are the difficult decisions we have to tell our populations? And I think the lack of leadership across Europe is rather striking.
We'll come back to that towards the end of our discussion when we've brought in all the other elements. But two more quickish questions, if we could, on Ukraine before we move on. You mentioned, Janis, earlier, membership negotiations. Where are we now in the preparation and launching of those negotiations? And for those like me who might think, I understand the long-term aspiration, but in the middle of a war, why does it matter so much, and why is so much effort being put into preparing for membership when you have so many challenges to face? Why is it so crucial now? And a question to you both really about what happens, again, we talked about expectations, if progress is too slow and the EU delivers too slowly. But Janis, why is this so important to the Ukrainians, and where are we now?
Well, I think you just have to listen to them. It is part of their vision for the future. Yes, they are defending their country against a war of aggression. They are trying to regain their sovereignty. They're trying to make sure that they can determine their own future. And in all that, becoming a part of the European family, of the EU family, is a core element. This is being perceived as a core element with respect to what it means for the future of Ukraine. So you cannot distinguish one from the other. It is a core element of how Ukrainians foresee themselves in the future. So that's also why they are so much investing into preparing, into responding to the Commission requests, and into making sure that the country moves in the right direction. Now, again, they're not naive. They know that the country is still facing a lot of problems, obviously. When you look into the economic situation, when you look into issues related to corruption, when you think of what it requires to become a member of the European Union, they are not naive, but they see this as being a vital interest of the country. And it is not an issue of whether that they believe that this will happen in the upcoming years and that there will be a quick entry into the European Union. So even if you hear that they have an aspiration of 5 years, if you remember back to the 1990s and early 2000s, we had also discussions about how long will it take for countries of Central and Eastern Europe to join the European Union. And this 5-year perspective was in front of them. And then we extended that by multiple years beyond the 5 years. And then there's the other dimension, which they're also aware of, which includes the capacity of the EU to enlarge. And so this is the
Let's
other
come back
side
on
of
that
the coin.
capacity issue later on. But Fabian, not naive, but the expectation is there. Janis has explained why it's so important to Ukraine. Do you believe that the EU as a whole are committed to this process, or again, do we see this discrepancy depending on where you are in the EU as to how committed you are to those membership negotiations? And what are the risks of promising too much and delivering too slowly?
Yeah. I mean, I think just to add to what Janis was saying, I think the recognition in Ukraine is that your sovereignty, your prosperity, your security is protected by being part of these organizations, EU, also NATO, etc. So this is not a contradiction. This is essentially what Ukraine is fighting for. And in that context, we should also see the enlargement process. And what we are doing in that process, in my view, is shameful, because we are not wanting to face the difficult questions. I'm not saying Ukraine can be a member tomorrow. Everybody knows there is a process which has to go through. But for that process, we actually need to see what is our plan? How are we going to go about it? What are the steps along that way? How are we going to deal with also the very challenging questions which will come, given that Ukraine will still share a border with Russia, given that the conflict will still be there in some form or other. So we need to start having these discussions. What I rather see in most countries, apart from the countries directly bordering Russia, directly being threatened by that, but what I see in most countries is almost an embarrassment that the Ukraine is reminding the Europeans about the commitments we have made. And I see no action whatsoever, also, for example, on the Western Balkans, where we could actually show that we mean this seriously. And the only conclusion I can draw from that is that in many countries, we don't mean it. And if we don't mean it, then we shouldn't create these expectations because that will backfire.
Okay, one very quick last question, then we really do need to move on because there's so much to discuss. It's just in relation to reconstruction, because we see calls, for example, from Charles Michel to use $300 billion worth of frozen foreign exchange assets, Russian assets, to help fund reconstruction. Is there enough work being done at EU level on preparing for post-war recovery, reconstruction, and indeed the return of refugees? Janis, a really short one if you would, and then I want to take a question from the audience which links to the rest of our conversation.
Well, first of all, with respect to reconstruction, yes, there are thoughts which are being shared, there are initiatives, and you just mentioned the one by Charles Michel, but on the other hand, if you take into account what an immense reconstruction we're talking about. Ukraine is a very big country with a large population. The destruction on the ground is immense and it's still continuing. So for the country to be reconstructed in order to be able to embark on a brighter future, that will require a huge amount of reconstruction, a huge amount of money.
Yeah.
And both, by the way, there's also a question with respect to the moral reconstruction of the country, which has to do also with the international courts regarding the war crimes. But there's a lot which needs to be done. And I think that in view of what is required, we are not doing enough. Just the last point, because I want to be a bit bolder than what Fabian was saying with respect to the EU 27 and the differences regarding how much one feels that there is a necessity to enlarge and also to include Ukraine in future rounds of enlargement. There are some who believe that that can still be avoided. There are some who believe that once the situation regarding the war will ease, when it become less of a threat, that we will find ourselves in a situation where potentially we might not have to deliver when it comes to the questions of enlargement. We have seen that in the past, and there are some who are thinking that at the end we will have issues related to corruption in Ukraine, which will help us to not open the door of the European Union. That is sending the wrong signal.
Okay,
because
I'm going to have to stop you there because we really do need to move on. But Nico Keppens, really from our audience, linking this to what we're going to talk about now. His first is a sort of question, a broad question about, he's referring to George Orwell's novel 1984, and says that in 1984, the world is divided into three powers, fighting one another, changing sides overnight, and society is organized permanently in a war mode. Is there a possibility, says Nico, that this becomes a reality? And he also then adds, in this new world, will this new world be based on the consequences of this war, or find a balance with changes needed, for example, to fight climate change? Perhaps less focus on consumption, more equality between the world's region. If the first will lead to division, if it's the second, more need to work together. So really, I mean, this links, I think we can't predict whether we're going to be in a 1984 scenario, Fabian, but in terms of focus on the consequences of the war or this broader way of looking at it, how do you see the discussion? You said earlier, we're not waking up to the Zeitenwende, we're not recognizing what it means. How do you see the future and that balance between the focus on the consequences of this war and these broader issues?
I think it's very dangerous to give me an occasion to be as bleak as that, because I think we are really facing a tremendous challenge, and maybe it's not quite as bad as 1984, but it's not a long way off, because what we are facing is a much more unstable world, a much more contested world, a world where international organizations are barely functioning or not functioning at all, a world where we will have more conflict of a variety of different forms, not only conflict in the hard security military sense, but also conflict over economics, over prosperity, over the environment, over water. It is a much more difficult world, and a world where also governments will intervene a lot more, where things will be driven by politics, by power, where the danger is that we're moving into a world where might is right. As long as you're strong enough, you can do whatever you want. So we are facing a very difficult world, and I think the comment is absolutely right. The big challenge is going to be, how do we achieve common global goals in a situation where cooperation is conditional, where cooperation is driven by these political economy, geo-economic, geopolitical factors. And here I'm going to be unashamedly normative. We have to do it. There is no choice. We have to achieve both the appropriate response to the watershed, as well as the major transformations which we are facing. Because when it comes to climate change, this is a fundamental, I would say, existential problem. And what we're doing at the moment is not enough. But this is a tremendously difficult situation, and there is a good chance that we get it wrong, and that we are going to impair the ability of future generations to live in a world not only which is secure and prosperous, but actually to live in a world where the environment is stable, where we can continue to see a long-term future for humanity.
Thank you. Janis.
I will, because Fabian was rather negative and bleak, I would like to turn the perspective on things a bit. And starting from the normative necessity which Fabian was referring to, there is a normative necessity to understand the major challenges we're facing, which in many ways, the war in Ukraine has been an accelerator of all trends. But that means that we still have, if we understand the gravity of the moment, and as I said, I don't think we have understood the full gravity of the moment, there still is the chance for the EU to co-determine its future. It won't be able to determine its future by itself in the world as the one which Fabian has described, but it has the possibility to be able to shape the future world. But for that, it has to get rid of old recipes. It has to break taboos. It has to do more strategic thinking. It must not avoid the tough discussions among the U27, which are now pushing to the sides because we feel that we need to defend our unity. If you think along these lines, relating it to what we're discussing earlier, if you see enlargement as a strategic imperative, if you see that defense cooperation is something which is very vital and necessary, which we still haven't understood, if we understand that, yes, we also need to reform the European Union, if we understand that migration and asylum is something where we cannot follow the old trajectory, and if we understand what also this war means with respect to our potential future relationship with China, if we reconsider how we do things, there is a chance that we can play a role. So this is not about being bleak and negative and giving up. It's rather about having a sober analysis of where we are, and on that basis, think of what needs to be done.
Okay.
Often it reminds me, by the way, of the early months of 2010, where some people were thinking the Greek crisis is just something which is affecting 2% of our economy and won't affect anyone else of us. And I find we find ourselves almost 1 year after the 24th of February, in a situation where we have not yet fully jointly understood the gravity of the moment, especially those who are far away.
I want to address all of those issues that you've just touched on, and we have half an hour to do so. So I'm going to take us on a whistle-stop tour around some of those challenges. And I want to start with the energy and cost of living crisis, because Fabian, you said in answer to my first question, you said the most difficult part is yet to come. And one of the things you talked about was the preparation for next winter. There's also the impact now. Yes, gas prices are easing. That is making the situation. And as you say, we've had a relatively mild winter, but you seem to suggest that really not much is being done to prepare for next winter. But I, for example, see that a lot of reports about changes in the energy mix and where supplies come from in many countries. So what is your assessment? How bad is it in terms of not preparing for the future? Have we just been very lucky and we'll be back in exactly the same place next winter?
I think, firstly, we have been lucky. We have not had the demand for gas, which might have been created if we had, for example, a very severe winter. And that is not to say that we haven't done things. It is true that in many countries, a lot has changed in a rather short period of time. In some countries, more driven by what Russia has been doing, because if you switch off the gas, then countries will have to find alternatives. But this is not, in my view, yet anywhere near the systemic response, which we are going to need, which actually means that we have to look also at the energy market as a whole, and not just simply discussing what we essentially at the moment is a discussion around how do I plug the national holes which are appearing. Because the other part of this, and we just touched upon this a moment ago, is the question of climate change. Is the question of, is the path we are now going down a temporary glitch which we have to put into place to deal with the current situation? Or are we actually setting a pathway now which will make it virtually impossible to go back to the kind of climate action which is needed? And that is something which we are going to need to decide over the next few months. We have to start thinking also about how do we ensure that this is compatible with the cost of living and the cost of doing business. We shouldn't forget, yes, there is the very real challenge of people not being able to pay their food and energy bills. But there's also the very real challenge that our businesses, our companies have to compete in a global environment where energy cost is a major factor, and where one of our main competitors, who's also one of our main allies, has far lower energy costs than we do. So how are we going to deal with that? And that's also in the context of the Inflation Reduction Act, in the context of the US pushing green technology now at the domestic level. It's the question of the subsidy raise and the instinct at the European level. And that's a very broad statement, but I think you can see it in many different areas. The instinct at the European level is actually to renationalize these questions. It's to say, let's go back to the member states, let them deal with it. They are much better able to deal with it. If we continue to go down this route, and I think we are already on the way, but if we continue to go down that route, that will destroy key pillars of European integration, not least the single market.
I want to come back on that very point, because you said earlier on, we are going backwards, we are looking inward. For you, clearly an area, this is one of those areas where we're doing it. Janis, just a thought on this and a thought on the EU's role, both in terms of addressing the energy crisis, but when it comes to the cost of living crisis, is there much that the EU can do, or is it primarily trying to coordinate, trying to make sure that everyone holds together? And then we'll come to the specifics of the response to the Inflation Reduction Act and why that is proving such a challenge.
No, I think there is a lot which the EU can do. And when we say the EU, what do we mean? And Fabian was alluding to the fact that a lot is being happening at the national level, which, by the way, is not per se something which is negative if you coordinate in the right way. And here I think there is a problem. So it's not only about having the right initiatives at the EU level, or even putting in place legislation which is necessary in order to translate some of the objectives which you have. It's also about coordinating among member states and not having, and there is this increasing reflex, and we have been talking about it in the past, of me first, looking at one's own situation, not coordinating, not looking at what the implications are of decisions which are being taken in certain member states, especially in key member states, on other EU countries. We're not having an extensive debate. We're having a debate, and I think it will become stronger, about how we show solidarity with those who are not able to support their economies in the same way. Fabian was already alluding to the pressures on the single market. These are examples of where we see that there is not the reflex of thinking the EU dimension of decisions being taken at the national level, and we see that in many member states.
Can I just ask on that very point? These discussions that are being had on whether we should have, as one way round, those member states with the deepest pockets being able to support their industries, those who have less resource not being able to, and therefore you distort the single market level playing field. This call for another round of common joint EU borrowing, described by the Dutch ambassador to the EU as, quote, Karl Marx on steroids. That would indicate that there is little or no chance of getting agreement on common borrowing. Is that how you read the situation, Janis? Or is there sufficient pushback from other member states to keep this on the table?
I think it's going to be, yes, I think it's going to be, it is on the table. It's going to be on the table. It's also going to be one of the issues which will be discussed at the February informal summit, probably then also moving then to March thereafter. So this is something which is on the table. The pressures will increase. But I do not think that we are now in a situation, because there is this discussion as to how much it resembles the situation of 2020, which eventually led to Next Generation EU. We are in a different situation. Also, the perceptions in key countries, you were referring to the Netherlands, but also if you look into Berlin, the perception is that others are also supporting their economy. But the pressure will increase. There's also discussion as to whether you might have something along the lines of the logic of the SURE instrument, which we had at the time, which, to remind all of us, is a loan-based system. It's not about
to do with unemployment
grants.
supporting
Exactly, to supporting the consequences of COVID on the employment situation in member states. But that was not at the same scale and not also of the same logic of Next Generation EU. And I do not see that we're moving in that direction. But the pressure is there. It will increase, and the numbers are justifying that there is this pressure. But you see that not only, like you were referring to the Dutch example quote, but also if you talk to people in Berlin, the reaction is not, and the logic is not being perceived along the lines of 2020, where Angela Merkel understood, and then eventually that led to an agreement with France, which then led to the agreement at the EU level, that it was in Germany's interest to have something along the lines of what then led to Next Generation EU, on not only on the table, but being implemented. That's not the thinking at the present time.
Okay, Fabian, on that point about borrowing, please do comment, but more broadly on the issue of the single market. And when we talk big argument raging now about the relaxation of state aid rules to allow member states to subsidize their green industries as a response to the Inflation Reduction Act, we've seen warnings from people like Mario Monti. This is a dangerous road to go down. We've had a letter to the Trade Commissioner Valdis Dombrovskis from 7 member states attacking plans for what they call permanent or excessive non-targeted subsidies, linking this whole thing to the strategic autonomy debate, linking it to those like the French calling for much more of a bi-European approach. How do you see, is this the EU becoming a protectionist bloc where it has traditionally been the champion of free trade, or is that to exaggerate where we are? Is this a particular circumstance for a particular moment? Is this a long-term, is this a Zeitenwende for competition policy and the single market?
I think when we look at this whole complex of industrial policy, single market policy, it is a Zeitenwende. It was something which was already in progress because the world has been changing. But it's also part of a wider development where essentially we have created a system which is inward looking, which was about controlling what the other member states are doing. And we now need to change that system to something which is much more outward looking. And that's a big change, which will require also breaking some of the taboos. This is one of the areas where it's about breaking taboos. And unfortunately, at this moment in time, my conclusion is that all the member states are wrong. And what is going to happen, in my view, is this debate around common borrowing, it's inevitable. So where we are going to go is we will allow member states to do a lot more at the domestic level. And as a kind of compensation, we will establish a rather minor fund at the European level, reusing money which hasn't been used elsewhere, very little new money, but ultimately it will be pointed to say, but we are also doing something together.
Not enough to protect the level playing field, not enough to protect the single market.
No, because it's completely the wrong strategy. It's nothing to do, because industrial policy is not just public money. This is about actually getting together and having a strategic discussion. And that's where also countries like the Netherlands and Sweden are wrong, because the pressures which are there coming from the Zeitenwende, coming from this changed global environment, means we have to do more industrial policy together. It is inevitable that we will have to do that. So what they need to do is put constructive proposals on the table, and just saying no is not going to work, because the pressures are so great that unless there's something done in common at the European level, then we will revert back to this renationalization. And what we will then see is that countries like Germany, which have the fiscal means, will use subsidies very heavily.
Okay.
That will fragment the single market. It will also have international consequences. So we're moving in exactly the wrong direction, but all of the member states are not addressing this constructively, because it means breaking the taboo of actually saying, for the first time, we are going to have a meaningful industrial policy at the European level.
Indeed, thank you. We need to move on, because I want to talk about migration briefly, and then I want to talk a little bit about relations with third countries, and then we'll try and draw some conclusions from this discussion. Janis, on the issue of migration, meeting this week of EU Justice and Interior Ministers, talking about asylum and immigration, talking about the pact that has been bogged down, has been getting nowhere. We heard the leader of the EPP in the European Parliament, Manfred Weber, warning this week. He said, we are sleepwalking into a new migration crisis. The issue is coming back with a vengeance. He says it's been a taboo since 2015. The sort of things we're seeing, the sort of things being discussed, it all seems to be focused on tougher border controls, more infrastructure. It's all very much focused on the prevent. We don't see much, as far as I can see, on legal migration, routes for legal migration and so on. What is your reading of where we are? And this will be discussed at the summit in February. Any chance of breaking the deadlock here?
Well, first of all, you were saying it's coming back with a vengeance.
Manfred Weber was saying.
I know you were quoting him.
Indeed.
But that's not a surprise. We knew that the pressures coming from migration are not away. It's just the question of at what moment and for what reason they might become stronger. And we also know, and we know that for a very long time, even before 2015, the so-called migration crisis. And again, it's not a surprise that the responses we're now looking for are related towards security, securing our borders, securing the fact that we will be able to control the numbers. It's not about solidarity, responsibility dimension. But again, this is not a new debate. It's a very old debate. And I think the fact that we're now seeing, and you were analyzing it correctly via your question, that we have the strong emphasis on the one dimension of the issue relates to the fact that we have, as EU 27, in many ways giving up, that we will find a systemic solidarity response to this. So we're trying to protect ourselves, and we're having discussion at national level. If you see the Austrians, how much they're pushing and using also the leverage vis-a-vis Bulgaria and the Schengen question there, asking for building a wall or a fence, whatever you want to call it, and having support coming from the EU. That is something which we have de facto already been seeing in the discussion for a long time. Look into the fence which was built between Greece and Turkey in order to defend the EU, not only Greece, from people pouring into the EU via Turkey. Now, that is all very short-sighted because it doesn't really address the fundamental problems which are underneath that. So we're looking into quick recipes, easy recipes, which also have a political dimension to it, because we know how much migration is an issue related to politics, how much it is also an emotional issue, and how much it is also being used as a political argument, and that will not stop. And if numbers go up, this is the reflex which we're having. So in many ways, unfortunately, the EU27 have already taken the decision that they are and will be focusing on the security dimension, not on the solidarity and responsibility dimension. And that is short-sighted.
Thank you. And I would urge anyone who hasn't yet taken a look at the book of Conversations with Herman Van Rompuy, particularly to look at that migration chapter, where he says of all the issues he dealt with in politics, domestically and at EU level, always the toughest nut to crack, or the one he says where we never have really found the answer, particularly at the EU level. Fabian, if I might, I want to move us on because I want to talk third countries. I want to come back briefly to the US because I mentioned this issue about Buy European Act. There is a debate going on in Europe at the moment. Do you essentially take a confrontational approach and say, right, you're doing Buy American, we'll be Buy European, or as other countries are arguing, no, let's try to get some concessions to get greater access for European companies to some of these subsidies and so on. How do you see that argument evolving? And then to Janis, so I'm going to break it down to each of you, on China. Ursula von der Leyen said in a speech last night, we need to focus not just on the US on this issue, but also on China with, and I quote, its massive hidden subsidies and denial of access to European countries. On the US, Fabian, your analysis of the EU's approach to this and whether it should be, and the argument over confrontation versus conciliatory looking for concessions.
On the US, I think we have failed to see the signs of the times. This was always coming because this is not simply a Biden agenda. It's not explained by short-term developments. It is essentially a combination of two things. One is the lack in the US of belief in international systems. They no longer see them as being in their interest. And secondly, and that's where I'm already straying a bit into Janis's field, this is about also the global confrontation with China and how do you position yourself in that. So Europe will have to deal with this as a reality, whether it's the Inflation Reduction Act or something else. This is the context in which we are going to be having these exchanges with the country, which in the end is still the most important ally we have. Certainly from an economic perspective, it is the biggest economic relationship in the world, but also from a security perspective. So the idea that somehow we would now go on to a confrontational course with the US is essentially fanciful. We are not going to start a trade war in a situation where the US is absolutely necessary as the backstop when it comes to our security. So I think this also shows about what kind of global environment we will have to deal with. And I think there is a question here, and I do make also the link to China here. I think one of the things we should be looking into as Europeans is if we don't have the multilateral system anymore, which has been incredibly beneficial for Europe, but if we don't have that anymore to rely on, are there other ways we can find ways of cooperating with countries like the US? So one of the things, for example, we're thinking about at the moment is this question of what does it mean when we talk about like-minded countries? Is there something where we can fill that concept with something concrete, where we can actually say like-minded countries should also mean something in terms of the relationship with each other? And this could be an example. Like-minded countries could be something where you are cooperating, for example, on green technology.
Okay. Janis, China, particularly, please do react to that briefly, but on the question of China and Ursula von der Leyen's warning that maybe we're focusing too much on the US in this area at the moment, and we also need to do more on China, and if we do, what?
By the way, if we discuss US and China, You cannot separate one from the other.
No.
But just one remark towards the US, because I subscribe to what Fabian was saying. And I think that by giving a also strong response to the Inflation Reaction Act is something that will also help to find a concession, or to help find a compromise with the U.S. And it's not only with the Biden administration, it's also with Congress, so it makes it more difficult. But I want to reiterate that. Or also strengthen the argument that we have multiple interdependencies between the U.S. and the EU. And there's a lot in the logic now, which is we are so much dependent on the US because of the war in Ukraine, and that has shown even more how much dependent we are. Also, the US is dependent on us. And if you take the Chinese dimension into it, the US also wants us to be interdependent with them when it comes to China. And with regard to Ursula von der Leyen and her remark, I think that her remark was valid. I think it's based on a sound analysis of the situation. We have more problems when it comes to China than we have with respect to the US, not undermining the issues we have with the US, but we have more issues. And we're seeing lately an attempt to improve the relationship between China and the EU. But I think if you look at it in a longer dimension, this triptychon of China being a partner, economic competitor, and a systemic rival, I think the economic competitor bit and the systemic rival bit have been increasing for a longer time. And I don't see that this will be changing, even though there are now attempts from Beijing. And the reaction of Ursula von der Leyen, or the remark which she made, I think is exactly also mirroring that, because in the longer term, there is an issue with respect to our relationship with China, and that is affected by our relationship with the US.
One other issue in relation to it, still pains me to describe us this way, but third countries, Fabian, relations with the UK. A lot more optimism, it seems now, that a way forward can be found. How do you see the prospects for EU-UK relations, not least in light of the war in Ukraine, UK support for Ukraine, EU support for Ukraine, and the degree of coordination there, or not? How do you see things evolving over the coming year?
I would hope that we collectively recognize, but particularly in UK domestic politics, that the current situation clearly calls on like-minded countries to work much closer together. And I think when it comes to Ukraine, UK has been doing what is necessary, has been in many ways at the forefront, however you define that. However, when it comes to the relationship, in the end, this is still about UK domestic politics. I'm not as hopeful as many people are, given the absolute disintegration we are seeing within the UK political system. It is very hard to see how any part of the political system, any leader, can make any real impact on the long-term relationship, because in the end it's about fragmentation, it's about the system just simply not working. Maybe we will get a small agreement on some of the issues around Northern Ireland. Even that I'm not sure, because ultimately the unionists in Northern Ireland are very much opposed. The European Research Group has already said to Rishi Sunak that they would not be happy in what they see the UK giving away sovereignty again. So ultimately, yes, maybe we'll make a little bit of progress, but it doesn't address the overall question. The overall question is about having a much more constructive relationship, and I cannot see that at this moment in time. I even think it's very, very unlikely in the medium term, given the positions of politicians in the UK.
Thank you very much. And Janis, very quickly, if you would, in terms of other countries in our direct neighbourhood, do you see any revisiting of those issues over the coming months, or is there simply too much else on the agenda?
No, I see that. I think that we're seeing that there is a revisiting of our relationship, especially with countries in our eastern direct neighborhood. And we see also developments here. We see that the discussion about the Western Balkans in terms of the enlargement process have been picking up. We see concrete decisions which have been taken, which a year ago were not on the agenda. So we're drawing some lessons also from the Ukraine experience, and also fearing that the influence of Russia in the Western Balkans is might be enhanced, and that is obviously not in our interest. So we see developments regarding Western Balkan. We already were discussing Ukraine. I mentioned Moldova, and let's not forget also Georgia earlier. But also there's a discussion about Eastern Partnership as to how that relationship or that forum, this setting, can be used in future to change the relationship, to enhance the relationship with the countries in that region. So there is development, there are developments, but I think again a lot will depend, and these developments stem from the fact that we have understood that we need to do more because of the Ukraine war, showing us what potentially might happen if things move in the wrong direction. So this will very much depend on how the situation will develop in Ukraine, which has been the catalyst and it will remain the catalyst with respect to the discussion we're having on enlargement and neighborhood policy. And there is a danger that we might fall back if we think that the pressure is not as strong as it has been over the past year.
Indeed. I want to come to one last issue before we close this week's update. And it is the question, and it goes back, Janis, you mentioned it, talking about some of the myriad challenges that we faced, and you talked about the need to reform the European Union. And my question, and I'll come to you first on this one because you raised the point, is this really, given all the challenges that we're facing, and the scale of them and the unpredictability of the coming year, we've talked about that at the beginning, particularly with relation to the war in Ukraine. Is this the right moment to launch fundamental EU reforms, including the possibility of changing the institutional arrangements, treaty reform? Very struck, actually, that the Franco-German summit at the weekend, we haven't talked about that, we'll talk about it in a minute, but there was in their joint declaration a reference to treaty change, to moving, for example, to qualified majority voting on foreign policy, on tax, a shift, I think, from the French position of before. But is this really the right moment to try? And is this a moment when it could succeed? Fairly briefly, if you would, Janis.
I think the big response to your question would be, when is the right moment? Imagine if we have been talking about the problems which we're facing as an EU to react to the current crises and to the fundamental challenges we're facing. And in many ways, if we would have reformed the EU earlier, I think we would be now in a better situation to react to these challenges, to these crises. But we weren't able to do because there was no support from especially the side of the Council, from member states, to engage in that endeavor. Also after the experience of 2005. And the failed constitutional treaty at the time. So there are many reasons to argue that it's not the right moment, and member states think that it's not the right moment. On the other hand, I think it is the right moment to intensify debates, to intensify thinking about how to potentially reform the EU's governance structures, how to concretely reform them. It's not about having a general debate, it's about having a concrete debate about what is needed. And I think we need to do that even though there is no real political appetite on the side of member states to push things forward when it comes to governance and institutional reforms. And you were referring to the German Franco declaration. If you look at it very closely, when it comes to reforms, it says we are supporting changes to the institutional structure, provided that there is a consensus among the EU 27 to do so.
That's big like provided. That's a big like, provided, yes.
That's like saying that, you know, at the end of the day, if everyone agrees, we'll go for it, but we will not invest political capital into it. And that's what is actually happening. We see nice Sunday speeches also from individual leaders, by the way, so not only in the Franco-German context, which at the end of the day, many of these leaders, when it comes to investing political capital into making this possible, this is not being done. And you hear the logic of, there are, if you remember the discussion about having a convention, there are 13 countries who signed a letter being against it. How can we then try to work against 13? Well, if that's the logic, then you're not portraying the political leadership needed in order to reform the European Union. So is it the right time? There will never be the right time, but I think it is the time to intensify the debates and the thinking about it, even though it will take some time to get there, because now there's not the political appetite.
And Fabian, a reaction from you to that, and also a question, do you see the fact that we are now moving into pre-election mode, 2024 European Parliament elections, again, is that likely, do you think, to have an influence on this discussion about fundamental EU reform?
I think firstly on this question, or is there political will, how do we move forward? I think again, as in many areas we've discussed today, there's no strategic thinking, there's no strategic discussion. If people are saying we need to change the treaties, why? What is the reason why there's a necessity now to change the treaties? Is it because we don't want to be in a situation where one member state can hold up the rest? Well, then I think the question is much more short-term. We need to find a way of being able to stop that now, not go through years and years of a convention which might or might not result in something which helps. We have tools which can be used now to address these questions, but let's be clear about what these questions are. And I suspect one of the things which we are going to find is that on many of these, there's no agreement between the member states. So ultimately, they're using these nice words as a way of hiding the underlying disagreement. So you don't actually have to address it because nothing will happen.
So the significance of that quote that Janis gave about we support it if there is a consensus is the ultimate cop-out.
You don't support it.
Yeah,
yes.
Exactly.
It means ultimately you don't expect anything will happen, but you can always say, but we would have. It's and I mean, I'm not singling out these two countries. I think this is right across the European
But they are the
Union.
two countries that traditionally provided the leadership, effectively abdicating the leadership.
Yes, and I think it's also whether they can lead the European Union alone. I mean, the co-leading, which I've already talked about, I think it's a necessary condition that these two countries are on board, but it's not a sufficient condition. So you have to have much more. But on the EP election, I hope I'm wrong here, but I think it's going to be a catastrophe. It's going to be a catastrophe because given all the challenges we are facing, many people will stay at home. Those people who feel very strongly that the world is going in the wrong direction, that their government is going in the wrong direction, are going to vote for extremists. In the minds of many people, the only thing which will stick to their mind is going to be the corruption scandal and the general perception of the institutions as not functioning. On top of that, we have Manfred Weber flirting with the post-fascists. All of that together will, in my view, mean low participation. It will mean a more fragmented, a more polarized parliament. And that will then raise questions about the institutional structure, about how Europe works, but in a very negative way. I think people will be saying, well, the parliament isn't functioning, so do we actually need all of this at the European level? So I'm rather pessimistic about what might happen next year, also because I don't see any European debate in any country. What people are debating is purely on a national level.
Mm. I hate to end on a gloomy note, so Janis, can you cheer us up at all about the prospects for the European elections, or do you share Fabian's bleak analysis?
No, I think it is a valid analysis and a valid prediction, but we're still in January of 2023. So if that is our prediction, if many of us, and not only the three of us, would agree on that, but even if we have the appreciation that what Fabian was describing might become reality, and I would add to that that you would also then, in this scenario, witness an increase of those who will be using the election in order to develop green populism and energy populism, which is something which then would profit from these from what Fabian was describing. If we understand that, that would means that there's also an ability to counter that. There is something to be done about that when it comes to thinking about the campaign. There's something to be done about it when it comes to selecting who will be the front figures, whether we call them Spitzenkandidaten or not. But there is something that can be done and should be done. The question is whether you have the willingness and the political renewable energy to invest into that. And if Fabian is right, and I see also the same development, that we don't care about the European dimension at the national level in many ways, it is an afterthought to think about what the EU means for discussion, which we're having at the national level in a lot of member states. If that is the basic attitude, we're moving in the wrong direction.
And on that note, thank you both very much indeed for joining me today. That is all we have time for. Just a couple of things to flag up for you coming up. 2 publications, one which will touch on many of the issues we've talked about today and look at them in a lot more depth. The EPC Outlook paper, focusing on the key global actors and emerging policy challenges for the EU in 2023. That is entitled Europe in the World in 2023, Learning the Language of Power, ? Which will be published on the 1st anniversary of the Ukraine war. There is also a discussion paper due out very soon on digitalization and the clean energy transition. I'll link to an event on this topic next Tuesday. And we've been talking about EU-China relations. On February the 8th, just draw your attention, an online 60-minute briefing with the Chinese ambassador to the EU on EU-China relations in 2023, opportunities and challenges. So that's all from us for now. We will be back next month with another update. Thank you so much for joining us. It's always lovely to have so many of you with us, and we look forward, hopefully, to seeing you again then. Have a great weekend and take care.
Thanks very much.
Bye-bye.